The August heat clung to San Francisco like a curse that could not be erased. Thunder rolled across the bay in waves, and the mansion's marble floors reflected the lightning in fractured white bursts. Isabella Morgan stood frozen in the doorway of the study, her mop bucket dangling from trembling fingers, and stared at the impossible thing bleeding across mahogany. Raphael Rossi lay pressed against his desk like a knife that had been driven into the heart of his own empire. The white silk shirt he wore, expensive beyond her ability to comprehend, bloomed crimson below his ribs where a bullet had torn through flesh and certainty. His hand gripped the desk's edge with the desperation of a drowning man clawing for air that would not come. One eye opened. That eye, dark as a storm cloud gathering over water, found her face in the shadows. She should have run. Every instinct screaming through her bones demanded she turn and flee, that she call the police from the kitchen phone, that she become invisible the way she had learned to become invisible in this house for the past 2 years. But Isabella Morgan had learned something harder than fear. She had learned what it meant to die while still breathing, and she recognized it in the way his breathing grew shallow, the way his fingers relaxed with surrender. She dropped the bucket. Water exploded across marble like a small dark ocean, and she ran. The first aid kit lived in the bathroom down the hall, tucked behind towels that cost more than the deposit on her apartment. Her hands moved without permission from her mind, finding gauze, finding antiseptic, finding tape. She was back in the study before her heart finished its next beat. "Do not move," she whispered, though she did not know if he could hear her. She knelt beside him, her uniform, the navy polyester purchased from Walmart for $12 2 years ago, already darkening with his blood. The smell hit her then, metallic and hot and wrong. She pressed the gauze against the wound, applying pressure the way a YouTube video had taught her last year when she had cared for Mrs. Chen upstairs after her fall. His hand rose, surprising her with its gentleness. It covered hers, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. "Why," he whispered, his voice like gravel beneath rain, "are you helping me?" Isabella did not answer because the answer lived too deep, in a place she had learned not to speak from. She knew what abandonment looked like. She knew the particular despair of bleeding out alone, of watching the world go dark with no one to witness the moment you disappeared. She had felt it the night her sister vanished, the night the debt collectors came, the night she counted her money and found only $34 remained between herself and the street. $34. That was all Isabella Morgan owned in this moment as she knelt beside the most dangerous man in San Francisco and pressed her hands against his wound. But what she did not know, what neither of them could have imagined in that humid August darkness, was that in exactly 24 hours, this single choice, this one reaching out in the dark, would bring 50 men in black suits through these doors like a storm that could not be stopped. If you are still with us, drop a like on this video. Share it with someone you love and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Before we continue, you need to understand how Isabella Morgan arrived at this moment, bleeding out beside a man she barely knew, with nowhere left to run. Now let us go back 12 days earlier. The apartment was not really an apartment. It was a room that had once been a closet, converted into something slightly less than living space. The walls pressed in on all sides, painted a color that might have been white or might have been the color of surrender. A single window, the size of a showbox, looked out onto the fire escape of the building next door. Isabella Morgan stood in the center of this room, though standing in the center meant she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms to their full length and held a letter in her hands. The paper trembled because her hands had learned to tremble now. The words printed in bold black capitals trembled back at her. Final notice. $150,000. That was the number that had stopped making sense sometime around the 100th time she read it. The amount was so vast, so obscene in its size, that it had transformed into something abstract, like being told the moon owed money it could not possibly repay. The debt belonged to her sister. Rebecca had borrowed the money 7 years ago, promising it was temporary, promising she had a plan, promising she would repay every penny. Then Rebecca disappeared into Las Vegas with a man named Victor who smelled like expensive cologne and spoke in the careful lies of someone born to deception. Isabella had not heard from her sister in 4 years. The debt, however, had never forgotten Isabella Morgan. The debt had followed her like a ghost that refused to leave. The debt collector's last visit had been 3 days ago. A man in a suit that cost more than everything she owned, standing on the fire escape, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "We know where you work, Miss Morgan. We will find you." Isabella placed the letter on her bed, a twin mattress with no frame, placed directly on the floor, and counted the money in her wallet again. $34. 12 bills that represented her entire life, and they would need to last until her next paycheck. That paycheck was 4 days away. She opened the cupboard above the sink. 3 cans of soup. A box of crackers. Half a jar of peanut butter with a spoon already stuck in it, dried and hard from yesterday. She calculated. Soup for lunch. Crackers for dinner. She would eat sparingly. She had become very good at eating sparingly. The alarm on her phone vibrated at 4:53 in the morning. Still dark outside. The city had not yet remembered it was supposed to wake up. Isabella dressed in the clothes she laid out each night before bed. They hung on a hook behind the door because there was no closet, and caught the first bus heading toward Pacific Heights. The Ashford mansion rose above the city like a monument to all the things Isabella Morgan would never have. It was a palace of pale stone, with windows the size of doors and doors the size of rooms. She had worked as a live-in nanny for the Ashford family for 2 years and 3 months, sleeping in that converted closet on the 3rd floor, caring for their daughter, preparing meals, managing the household. Mrs. Victoria Ashford treated her the way one might treat an appliance that occasionally malfunctioned. Cool, dismissive, occasionally requiring correction. Isabella had learned to become silent in her presence, had learned to move through rooms like smoke, had learned to exist without being seen. But it was the child she had come for. Ava Ashford was 6 years old, with dark curls and eyes that held an intelligence that seemed too large for such a small face. She had been born into a world of expensive things, but something in her nature resisted the cold perfection of it all. When Isabella braided her hair, Ava asked questions about everything. When they read stories before bed, Ava's hand would slip into Isabella's, small fingers wrapped around hers with a trust that made Isabella's chest hurt. "Will you always stay?" Ava had asked one night, her voice drowsy as sleep approached. "Everyone leaves. Mommy leaves for parties. Daddy leaves for business. The last nanny left. I will stay as long as I can," Isabella had answered, which was not the same as promising forever, but it was all she could honestly give. The morning routine was methodical. Ava's breakfast prepared precisely, oatmeal with berries arranged in the shape of a smile. Her school uniform pressed. Her hair braided with the same care that mothers give to the precious things they have created. By 7:15, the car would arrive to take Ava to the private school 3 blocks away, where she would sit in classrooms with other children whose parents' names appeared in society columns. Victoria Ashford appeared in the kitchen that morning wearing a dress that probably cost $3,000. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had been taught that beauty was a responsibility. "The Westchester event is next Thursday," she said without looking at Isabella. "You will take care of Ava while I attend. Do not allow her to watch television. Ensure she practices her piano." "Yes, Mrs. Ashford," Isabella said. "And Isabella." Victoria paused, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a coffee cup. "Do try to remember your place in this household. You are staff, not family." The words landed like they were intended to land. They landed like a blade through air, clean and precise, leaving no visible wound but drawing blood all the same. Isabella did not respond. She had learned that responding only extended the pain. By afternoon, she was cleaning the study on the 2nd floor. This was Raphael Ross's private space, though the Ashford family never spoke of him directly. Victoria referred to him as the investor, spoken in the tone one might use to describe something unpleasant but necessary. The study was immaculate, lined with books that appeared never to have been opened, decorated in the careful manner of someone who understood that wealth should announce itself through restraint. Isabella had learned not to ask questions about who lived in this house beyond the Ashfords. She had learned that some things existed in the shadows of wealthy households, that some people occupied space without quite being present. But occasionally she would find things. A man's watch left on the desk. Cigars in the drawer. A photograph, briefly visible before being hidden away, of a small girl with dark curls and Raphael Ross's impossible eyes. The girl in the photograph could not have been older than 4. She was smiling. Beside her, Raphael Rossi looked like a man who had been given access to light. Isabella had closed the drawer carefully and asked no questions. By evening, exhaustion had settled into her bones the way it always did. She had worked since for 48 in the morning. 14 hours of movement, of presence, of making herself useful. She sat on her twin mattress in her converted closet and ate crackers with peanut butter, and calculated whether she would have enough money left for the bus fare tomorrow. Outside, the August heat pressed against the city without mercy. The forecast promised a storm was coming. The next 12 days moved like this. Isabella existed in the small spaces between dawn and dark, moving through the Ashford mansion like the ghost that everyone treated her as. Money leaked away. The final notice on her bed seemed to grow larger each day, the font becoming bolder, the deadline drawing closer with the certainty of a hammer striking downward. Then the August night arrived. The one where thunder rolled across the bay like an announcement. The one where Isabella Morgan would make a choice that would change everything. The humidity was suffocating. The air tasted like rain that had not yet fallen, like the moment before lightning strikes. Victoria had gone out for the evening, some gala at the museum. Ava slept upstairs, her breathing steady and innocent. Isabella mopped the floors, letting the repetitive motion quiet her mind. It was the sound that made her freeze. Not loud. A sound so small that most people would have missed it. A thud, like something heavy falling. Then silence. Then a sound that might have been breathing, or might have been something else. The study door was closed. It was never closed. Isabella set down her bucket and climbed the stairs, her worn shoes making no sound on the marble. The study door opened at her touch. What she saw in that moment, the blood, the wound, the most dangerous man in the city slowly bleeding out against his own desk, would be the moment she looked back on for the rest of her life. The moment everything changed. The moment she chose compassion when running would have been safer. She dropped the bucket. Water spilled. Her hands moved. And in exactly 24 hours, 50 men in black would arrive at these doors. The apartment was ash. Charred beams crossed overhead like a skeleton's ribs, and the acrid smell of burned wood and melted plastic hung in the August heat like a curse that could not be scrubbed away. Isabella Morgan stood in what used to be her bedroom, wearing borrowed clothes that didn't fit her properly, the sleeves hung past her wrists, the waistband gaped, and held a single photograph in her trembling hands. Her sister, Maya, aged 23, smiling in a sundress at a beach neither of them would ever visit again. That smile. That careless, beautiful smile from 4 months ago, before the casinos in Vegas, before the men with cold eyes and colder voices, before the debt came looking for someone, anyone, in the family to pay what Maya had stolen and gambled away. The fire inspector had written his report 2 hours ago. Faulty wiring in the basement. Unlucky spark. The building was old, he said. These things happened. He did not say, because he did not need to, that none of it mattered. Isabella had no insurance. The landlord had no insurance. The building would be demolished, and whatever Isabella had accumulated in 28 years of living, whatever small things she owned, whatever fragments of a life she had carefully arranged in those rooms, was now carbon and ash, indistinguishable from garbage. She had carried 2 bags out of the burning building. One held her work uniforms. One held this photograph. Everything else was gone. The letter had arrived 3 weeks before the fire. White envelope, official letterhead, the kind of correspondence that arrives with the weight of a stone dropped into water. She still had it, folded in her pocket, and she pulled it out now with shaking hands even though she had read it 17 times. Final notice. The words were stamped in red ink that looked like blood. To Ms. Isabella Morgan, for 47, Mercy Street, apartment 3B. Outstanding debt, account number 7742-91. Amount due, $150,000. Due date, August 31st. This account has been transferred to collection proceedings due to non-payment. You have 12 days to remit full payment or legal action will commence. 12 days. $150,000. A sister who had disappeared to Vegas 3 months ago and had not answered a single phone call since. A sister who had gambled away money she didn't have, borrowed from people who did not forgive, and left Isabella, who had never even been to a casino, who counted every penny, who had worked since she was 16 years old, holding the debt like it was a child she had to carry for the rest of her life. The collectors had found her at the apartment on Mercy Street. 2 men in grey suits who stood very still while talking. They explained, with a kind of patience that was somehow crueler than anger, the debt's transfer to family. That they knew where she worked. That they had her social security number, her employment history, her bank account balance, which was $312 on the day they visited, though by now it was less. That the timeline was non-negotiable. That if she did not pay, they would take her wages. They would take her car, which was worth nothing. They would file judgments that would destroy her credit for the next 7 years. They said all of this in voices that did not rise, did not threaten directly, but somehow made it clear that cooperation was the only option remaining to her. The fire had taken the apartment 2 weeks later. As if the universe was confirming what those men had already communicated, she had nothing left to lose because she had nothing at all. Isabella Morgan stood in the ruins of her life and opened her wallet with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. 2 20s. 1 10. For $1 bills. $34 total. In 12 days, she needed $150,000, and in her possession existed $34 and a photograph of a sister who had abandoned her to math that would never work. She put the bills back. She folded the photograph carefully and placed it against her heart, inside the borrowed shirt. Then she picked up the 2 bags and started walking toward the bus stop, toward the Ashford mansion in Pacific Heights, toward the only job left to her in the world. The mansion rose from the fog like something from an older century, all pale stone and high windows and a black iron gate that required a security code to open. Isabella entered the number 7747, the year the family empire began, and the gate swung inward with a soft electronic hum. The driveway curved through manicured gardens where groundskeepers maintained something that looked like a perpetual spring, where roses bloomed in colors that didn't exist in nature, where fountains murmured constantly, wasting water in a way that made her heart hurt. She had worked here for 8 months now. 8 months as a live-in nanny for Emma and Lucas Ashford, 6 and 5 years old, beautiful children with expensive educations and parents who traveled constantly. 8 months sleeping in a room that had once stored linens and cleaning supplies, a space so small that when she lay on the narrow mattress, she could touch the walls on either side with her arms outstretched. 6 feet by 8 feet. No window. The air conditioning vent was positioned so that it blew directly onto the cot, and she woke most mornings shaking with cold. The position paid $2,400 per month. After taxes, after the garnishment payments that the collectors had already begun against her wages, after rent, though technically she paid no rent, only received the closet as part of her compensation, after the transportation fee to get home 1 day a week, she had approximately $180 per month left. To cover everything else. Food. Phone. The medication she took for the anxiety that had developed sometime between her sister's disappearance and the collector's first visit. The math never worked. She pushed her bags up the service stairs, careful to use the narrow passage that Victoria Ashford had indicated was for staff. Never the main staircase. Never the grand marble steps where the family walked. Always the servant stairs, the ones that creaked, the ones with no carpet, the ones that felt like the building was reminding you of your place in it. Her closet room was exactly as she had left it that morning. Mattress. 1 pillow. A single blanket. A shelf holding 4 identical nanny uniforms, 3 pairs of shoes, 1 pair of jeans, 2 shirts. A small lamp that had belonged to someone else before her. No books. No decorations. Not because she didn't want them, but but because having things meant having something to lose, and she had already lost everything worth losing. She set the 2 bags on the mattress and sat down carefully, as if the bed might dissolve beneath her. The photograph. Her wallet with $34. The final notice letter. Everything that Isabella Morgan possessed in the world now fit in 2 bags and the pockets of borrowed clothes that didn't belong to her. The digital clock on the wall read 5:17 a.m. In 13 minutes, she would need to wake Emma and Lucas. In 30 minutes, she would prepare their breakfast. In 45 minutes, she would walk them to St. Ignatius Academy, holding Lucas's hand so he wouldn't run into traffic, listening while Emma talked about her art project, both of them treating Isabella as something that existed only when they needed something from her. As something that would disappear the moment they no longer required her services. She had loved both of them from the first day. This was the mistake. This was the wound that never closed. A knock came at the door. Sharp. Impatient. Victoria Ashford did not announce herself. She simply stood in the narrow doorway, one hand on the frame, her blonde hair arranged in the kind of style that required professional maintenance weekly, her silk robe catching the early morning light. "I heard you come in. Where have you been?" Isabella's mouth went dry. "There was a fire. My apartment building. I had to." "That is not my concern, Isabella. You are here now. The children need breakfast in 40 minutes, and the linens in the main bathroom need to be changed. There is a guest coming this evening. Ensure everything is immaculate." She did not ask if Isabella was all right. She did not ask about the fire, or whether Isabella had family, or whether she needed anything. Victoria Ashford existed in the mansion like a presence in a very expensive dream, her needs absolute, her expectations non-negotiable. "Yes, Mrs. Ashford." Victoria turned to leave, then paused. "And Isabella? That dress does not fit you properly. Find something appropriate. I do not want the children's friends to see our staff looking unkempt." The door closed. Isabella sat on the mattress, listening to the silence of the mansion at dawn, to the distant sound of gardeners working outside, to the faint hum of air conditioning that cost more per month than she earned. She pulled the letter from her pocket again and looked at the date. 12 days. She changed into her uniform and moved through the mansion like a ghost, like something that existed only in the spaces between other people's lives. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances worth more than her entire yearly salary. She made pancakes shaped like animals for Emma and Lucas, added sliced berries she could not afford to buy for herself, poured milk into glasses that had cost more than a car payment. Emma wrapped her arms around Isabella's waist and said, "Can you stay forever?" Isabella's hands froze mid-motion. She could not answer. If she opened her mouth, the sound that would come out would not be words. It would be something older and more broken. So she simply held the child and said nothing at all, and Emma did not understand that nothing at all was the kindest thing Isabella could offer her, because anything more would be a lie, and Emma deserved better than Isabella's lies. The day stretched out in the way days did when you were counting backward. Shower the children. Walk them to school, holding Lucas's hand, her other hand wrapped around the strap of the backpack that held their lunches. Return to the mansion. Clean the main bathroom. Strip and wash sheets. Iron 14 sets of linens. Begin preparations for the guest who was arriving this evening, someone important, someone whose name Victoria had not mentioned but whose arrival seemed to carry the weight of an inspection. At 4 o'clock, as Isabella was folding the final sheet, a black SUV pulled through the gates. The sound it made was wrong. Too deliberate. Like something heavy and dangerous entering a place where it did not belong. Isabella heard the gravel crunch beneath the tires from inside the mansion, heard the vehicle stop, heard the quiet that followed. A quiet that felt like a held breath. Like the sky before a storm. She stood motionless, the white sheet folded in her arms, and listened to the silence that meant everything was about to change. The black study was drowning in silence. Rain hammered against the windows with the sound of 1,000 fists demanding entry. Isabella Morgan stood frozen in the doorway, her cleaning cart abandoned in the hallway behind her, and stared at the man bleeding across the mahogany desk like her accusation. Raphael Rossi. The name she was never supposed to speak. The man whose photograph hung in the foyer, dark-haired, dangerous-eyed, the kind of beautiful that cameras understood and morality did not. He was 45, maybe 46, with silver threading through his temples like frost spreading across winter trees. His white shirt was soaked crimson. The ceiling above him gleamed with a chandelier that cost more than Isabella's annual salary. The floor beneath him was beginning to stain. A gun lay 3 feet away on the carpet. Papers scattered everywhere, some of them pink with blood. It was 11:47 at night. The mansion was asleep. Raphael's eyes found hers and something flickered there, calculation, dismissal, or possibly just the fever dream of shock. His breath came in wet, laboured pulls, like a man drowning on dry land. "Get out," he managed, each word costing him. "Before they come back." Isabella should have run. Every logical corner of her mind screamed it. She was nobody. A live-in nanny with $34 in her bank account and a debt collector's letter-stamped final notice burning in her pocket like a curse that could not be erased. She had no business here. No business knowing what she was seeing. No business being witnessed. She did not run. 5 years as a nanny had taught her something about blood. She had cleaned split chins and scraped knees, and that terrible afternoon when Lucas fell from the swing and the wound looked far worse than it actually was. Her hands understood panic without her brain's permission. Isabella moved to the bathroom attached to the study and pulled open the cabinet. First aid kit. Bandages. Antiseptic that smelled like a hospital's last prayer. She returned to find Raphael trying to stand and failing, his hand pressed against his ribs as if he could hold himself together through sheer force of will. "Stay down," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Let me see it. You should not be here. Neither should you. Bleeding like that." She pushed his hand away gently. The bullet had grazed his ribs in a furious line, angry and deep, but not through anything vital. Not this time. His skin was warm and trembling beneath her fingertips. She worked quickly, antiseptic first, her hand shaking now that adrenaline was catching up with her, catching up and dragging her heart into her throat. Gauze. Pressure. The simple mathematics of stopping blood. "Why didn't you run?" Raphael asked, watching her work with an expression she could not read. "Because 12 days ago I stood in the ashes of my apartment holding $34 and nobody came to help me either." The words escaped before she could stop them. "So I didn't run." Something shifted in his face. A crack in the stone. Thunder exploded directly overhead, so violent the windows rattled, and in that moment Raphael Rossi reached for his phone with fingers still wet with his own blood. "Tony," he said when the connection answered. "Send the cleaners. And tell Enzo we have a problem." He hung up. Looked at Isabella with eyes that suddenly seemed clear despite the pain radiating through his body. "You need to leave San Francisco tonight. The men who did this, they know I was supposed to be vulnerable. They'll come back. They'll find out you were here. And when they do, they will use you to hurt me." "I can't leave," Isabella said quietly. "I have nowhere to go." She did not mention the debt. Did not mention the 12 days counting down like a bomb in a locked room. Did not mention that leaving San Francisco meant the collectors would find her eventually, drag her down into whatever hole they had already prepared for her sister's sins. Headlights swept across the windows. 2 black SUVs, moving with the precision of machines that understood violence the way other things understood hunger. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires. Tony and Enzo entered the study first, both men in their 50s, both wearing dark suits and the expressions of people who had seen impossible things and decided to stop being surprised. For other men came with them, all armed, all moving through the room like ghosts trained by people who understood that silence was its own form of menace. They saw Isabella kneeling beside their boss, covered in his blood, her hand still shaking from the work of keeping him alive. Tony's hand moved toward his weapon. Enzo's eyes narrowed. Raphael held up one hand, a small gesture, but absolute. "She saved my life," Raphael said simply. "Clean this up." The men moved. They removed the gun from the carpet and disappeared it into one of their jackets as if it had never existed at all. They brought equipment from somewhere in the mansion's depths, something to dissolve the blood, something to restore the carpet, something to erase the evidence that death had come close enough to this room to leave fingerprints. Isabella watched them work. She understood that she was witnessing something that people like her were not meant to see. That knowledge sat heavy in her chest, like a hand pressed against her heart. When the room was clean, Raphael stood, carefully, testing his ribs, his breathing shallow. He gestured for Isabella to follow him. They moved to a sitting room off the study, a place of leather chairs and bookshelves that climbed toward a ceiling Isabella could barely see. A window overlooked the bay where lightning continued to illuminate the water like photographs of the end of the world. Raphael poured himself whiskey with hands that barely trembled anymore. He was a man accustomed to pain, Isabella realized. To crisis. To the particular loneliness of people who gave orders instead of taking them. "Sit," he said. "Not a request." Isabella Saturday. "Tell me why you can't leave San Francisco." She pulled the letter from her pocket with shaking fingers. The paper had become soft from being folded and refolded, the creases spreading like scars. Final notice. $150,000. 12 days remaining. Raphael's eye scanned it in the time it took Isabella to take a breath. When he looked up, something in his expression had changed. "My sister," Isabella said. "Gambling. She disappeared 3 months ago. The collectors found me and said family pays. Blood debt." She laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "I have $34. I make $2,400 a month as a live-in nanny for your family. I send $1,800 of that to the collectors every month and it doesn't even cover the interest. And you've been doing this for how long?" "Since my apartment burned." 3 months. 108 days. She had been counting. She would always be counting. 12 days left before they stop asking nicely. Raphael set down his glass. The whiskey caught the light, golden and poisonous. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked." "And because?" Isabella's voice cracked on the words. "Nobody came to save me. Nobody ever comes." The vulnerability hung between them like a suspended bridge. Raphael stood and walked to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the leather spines until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a photograph and handed it to her without speaking. A baby girl. Maybe 6 months old. Dark curls. Eyes that were unmistakably Raphael's eyes, but softer, innocent, still believing the world was good. "Ava," Raphael said, and his voice broke on the name. Actually broke, the way a bone breaks, the way things break that were never meant to repair themselves. 15 years ago. She lived 3 hours. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "The nursery," Raphael continued, "is upstairs. 3rd floor. I've never touched it. Never dismantled the crib or packed away her clothes. Sometimes I stand in the doorway and I can almost hear her breathing." He took the photograph back with shaking hands. "That's why I'm still here. Because leaving means accepting she's gone." The rain continued its assault on the windows. Somewhere in the mansion, the men were finishing their work, erasing blood, erasing evidence, erasing the night from ever having existed at all. Isabella understood, in that moment, that she and this man, this dangerous, powerful man, were made of the same broken material. That they had both learned to live in the spaces between grief and survival. That perhaps Mercy had not abandoned her after all, only arrived in an unexpected shape wearing expensive suits and carrying a gun. What Isabella did not know was that Preston Mercer had been listening outside the study door earlier that afternoon, had heard every word of the conversation between Raphael and Tony and Enzo. That he was already making calls to people who specialized in eliminating problems. That her kindness had painted a target on her back that she would not see coming until it was far, far too late. The thunder rolled across the bay like a warning nobody understood. The rain fell like a curse that morning, each drop hitting the pavement with the sound of a ticking clock. Isabella Morgan sat on the curb outside the Ashford mansion at 9:14 p.m., her duffel bag beside her containing everything she owned in the world. Her uniform was soaked through. Her hands trembled as she stared at the letter in her lap, the ink already bleeding into purple rivers across the paper. $150,000. 10 days remaining. The final notice from the collectors was no longer a threat, it was a deadline, and deadlines, she had learned, were the most honest things people ever wrote. She had $34 in her wallet. Not 35. 34. She had counted it 3 times in the bathroom before Victoria Ashford's perfect voice had cut through the sitting room like a blade wrapped in ice. "You're fired, effective immediately. Pack your closet and leave." The other women had laughed. That laughter still echoed in her ears, worse than any scream. The first text came at 9:23 p.m. Unknown number. Pay or we start with your fingers. Then another at 9:33 p.m. We know where you sleep, Morgan. Then another. And another. 7 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize but absolutely understood. The collectors were closing in. They always closed in. Isabella pulled her knees to her chest and thought about the Golden Gate Bridge. She thought about how the water below looked like mercy when you were drowning in debt. She thought about her sister, about the choices that had led to this moment, about the cosmic injustice of inheriting someone else's gambling addiction like it was a family home. She had been nobody before this job. She was nobody now. She would always be nobody. A black SUV pulled silently to the curb. The door opened without warning. Raphael Rossi stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, his white shirt soaking through, the expensive fabric clinging to his chest in a way that showed the bandages beneath. He was still healing. He was still bleeding, probably, but he had walked out into the August downpour anyway. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, carrying centuries of grief, found hers immediately. "Victoria doesn't own this house," he said quietly, each word deliberate as a gun being cocked. "I do. And you're not fired." Isabella looked up at him, rain streaming down her face mixing with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Preston said. "I have cameras in the laundry room," Raphael said. He extended his hand. The hand of a man who had built an empire on violence and ruled it through will alone. "Come inside. It's time to end this." She took his hand. His skin was warm despite the cold rain. His grip was steady. This was the moment everything changed, though she didn't know it yet. She only knew that for the first time in 3 years, someone had reached down into the darkness and pulled. At 11:16 p.m., Raphael made 3 phone calls from his study while Isabella sat wrapped in a blanket on his leather sofa, her hair still dripping, her body still shaking. Tony arrived first, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his expression shifting from concern to absolute focus when Raphael began to speak. Enzo came next, followed by 8 other men whose names she didn't know but whose loyalty was written in the way they moved, economical and certain, like machines programmed for precision. "Preston has been embezzling from the organization for 2 years, Raphael said, his voice steady, the voice of a man delivering a sentence. "He hired the men who attempted to kill me last week. He's been working with the Bratva to dismantle our operations and take control when I'm gone. He threatened Miss Morgan this morning. He ordered her to leave San Francisco within 24 hours. Tony's jaw tightened. "How long have you known?" 6 months. I was building the case carefully. Collecting evidence. Documenting every transaction, every call, every meeting. Raphael turned his laptop around. The screen illuminated with security footage from the laundry room. Preston's face, twisted with rage and entitlement, his hands rough on Isabella's wrist. Then financial records, spreadsheets showing millions diverted to shell companies. Then audio recordings of Preston's voice on the phone with men whose accents were distinctly Russian, discussing how to move against Raphael once he was dead. He was planning to use her as leverage, Enzo said, understanding immediately. If you loved her, he'd use her. Yes, Raphael said simply. Which is why I'm moving now. Isabella's breath caught. What are you going to do? Raphael looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw something she had never expected to find in the eyes of a man like him, gentleness. A choice to be merciful when he could have chosen otherwise. What I should have done the moment he made his first move. I'm going to let the federal government do what the federal government does best. I'm going to hand them a case so airtight they won't need me to testify. At 5:36 a.m., the rain finally stopped. The sky broke open like a wound healing, and in that moment of clarity, 12 black SUVs pulled silently to the curb outside the Ashford mansion. Not the vehicles of Raphael's organization, these bore federal plates. FBI. The agents emerged in tactical gear, 50 of them, moving with the coordination of a military operation, spreading across the property like a precision strike. Isabella watched from Raphael's study window, her hand trembling as she gripped the sill. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, turning the sky the color of old bruises slowly becoming skin again. The breach of Preston's guest house was swift and overwhelming. His door burst open. He emerged in silk pajamas, his face still bearing the softness of sleep, not yet understanding that his world was ending. An agent grabbed him by the arm. Preston tried to resist, then tried to run, then tried to bargain in the space of 3 seconds. An agent shoved him to his knees on the wet grass. His expensive pajamas soaked through. His hands cuffed behind his back. Preston Mercer, you're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, wire fraud, and extortion, the agent read flatly, as if reciting a grocery list, as if destroying a life took no more effort than that. Preston's face went the color of old paper. He looked up at the main house, saw Raphael standing in the window, and something fundamental inside him shattered. His mouth opened. Words came pouring out, broken and desperate. Uncle. Uncle, please. I'm sorry. It was a mistake. I'll fix it. Please? He was sobbing now, trembling like a caged animal finding the bars closing in, all his entitled swagger, all his cruelty, all his certainty that the world bent to his will, gone. Erased. Replaced by the most honest thing he had probably ever expressed, pure animal terror at consequences arriving. The agents dragged him to the van without gentleness. The door slammed shut. At the same moment, 3 federal agents entered the mansion and found Victoria Ashford in her bedroom, still in her silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly set, her composure already cracking like porcelain dropped from a height. The lead agent was a woman in her mid-40s with eyes that had seen every lie society could manufacture. Victoria Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and extortion, the agent said. This is absurd, Victoria said, but her voice shook. I want my lawyer. Your lawyer is already in custody, the agent said. She didn't smile, but there was satisfaction in her voice, the satisfaction of a hunter who has waited patiently and finally pulled the trigger. We've been building this case for 8 months. The debt collectors harassing Miss Morgan? You hired them. You had her sister's gambling debts transferred to Isabella's name through fraudulent documents created by a lawyer you paid $40,000. You burned down her apartment last month to destroy evidence. You did all this to keep Isabella desperate, controllable, and isolated enough that she would never question why a man like Raphael Rossi would offer her protection. The bedroom went absolutely silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. Victoria's face crumbled like a mask dropped on marble. You don't understand. I needed, the children needed. The children are in protective custody as of 2 hours ago, the agent said. And you're facing 35 years in federal prison. They led her out in handcuffs. News cameras lit up the front lawn like a sunrise, and by noon, her face would be on every screen in San Francisco. Socialite arrested in fraud scheme. Wife of wealthy businessman charged with extortion and identity theft. The headlines would multiply like a virus spreading through the city's consciousness. 40 years for Preston. 35 for Victoria. Their assets frozen. Their names destroyed. Their freedom erased. Death would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, systematic destruction. The kind that takes decades. The kind that echoes. Raphael stood beside Isabella as they watched the federal agents lead Victoria past them into the hallway. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But his hand found hers, and in that touch was something that had not existed in his world for a very long time, the possibility of redemption. The federal agents finished their work at 4:02 in the afternoon. Files sealed in boxes. Photographs catalogued. Evidence tagged and bagged. The Ashford Mansion study, where Raphael had bled and Isabella had saved him, returned to silence. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the bay outside looking polished like dark glass. Isabella stood in the foyer, arms wrapped around herself, watching the last agent carry boxes down the marble staircase. 24 hours. In 24 hours, a world she thought had no bottom had finally reached one. Raphael appeared beside her, Tony and Enzo flanking him like sentries. His chest was wrapped tight beneath his shirt, the bandages Isabella had placed with trembling hands still holding him together. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, held something that hadn't existed there before. Mercy, maybe. Or the possibility of it. "It's done," Raphael said quietly. His voice landed like thunder settling into the distance. Preston and Victoria will never hurt anyone again. Isabella looked at him. The debt. The $150,000. The final notice. "I have to pay." "You never owed a penny." Raphael stepped closer. Every document was forged. Your sister's gambling debts, the transfer of liability, all of it manufactured by Victoria. She needed you desperate, Isabella. Desperate people don't question. Desperate people don't run. The foyer seemed to tilt. Isabella reached for the banister. Raphael caught her elbow, steadied her as if she were made of something fragile that might shatter. "The debt collectors," she whispered. "They harassed me for months. They burned. They were hired by Victoria. They'll be arrested by end of week. All part of the same scheme." Tony stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the windows. "Boss, the lawyers are asking about the children. Emma and Lucas. Social Services is demanding placement within 48 hours. Raphael's jaw tightened. "Tell them no." "So?" "Tell them the children have a home. Here. If Isabella will have them." Isabella's breath caught. "I can't, I have nothing. I sleep in a closet. I have $34 to my name. I'm not guardian material." "You sleep in a closet because Victoria is a sadist who enjoyed watching you suffer," Raphael said, each word precise as a blade. "You have $34 because she stole everything else. And you're the only mother those children have ever truly known." The truth of it broke something open inside her. Emma's hand in hers during nightmares. Lucas teaching her a song he'd learned at school, off-key and perfect. The way they looked at her, like she was solid ground in an earthquake. "Yes," Isabella said, the word barely a whisper. "Yes." Raphael nodded once. Then it settled. Legally, financially, permanently. The study on the second floor still held the ghost of that night. The desk where Raphael had collapsed. The floor where Isabella had knelt beside him, her hand soaked red. But upstairs, on the third floor, was the room that had remained untouched for 15 years. Isabella pushed open the nursery door and stopped. Pink blankets in the crib. Tiny clothes folded in the dresser. A mobile shaped like stars and moons, frozen in time. Raphael appeared in the doorway, his breathing shallow. "Ava's room. I've kept it exactly as it was. As if she might walk back in and forgive me for letting her die." Isabella's throat closed. "What happened?" "Her mother died in childbirth. Complications the doctors couldn't prevent. Ava lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of holding her, of knowing she would never grow old, never laugh, never know what I would have become just to protect her. Raphael's voice cracked like old ice. So I kept this room. Like a tomb. Like a prayer to a God who wasn't listening. Isabella moved to the crib and gently touched the railing. Emma is 4 now. Lucas is 6. They're still here. Still alive. Still need you. I know. Raphael stepped inside. His men had never seen him in this room. I thought I didn't deserve to be a father again. That losing them both meant I should never touch another child. But watching you with Emma and Lucas, Isabella, watching you love them when you had nothing of your own, it broke something open. Made me remember that Ava would have wanted me to live. To let other children live beside me. What are you asking? I'm asking if we pack this room away. If we turn it into something for children who are here now. A library, maybe. Somewhere they can grow. Isabella nodded, tears sliding down her face. I'll help you. They spent the afternoon carefully removing items. The mobile came down first, Raphael handling it with the reverence of a man holding holy relics. The blankets were folded into a memory box, one pink blanket to keep, the rest donated to a shelter 3 blocks away. The clothes, barely worn, went into bags for a children's hospital. By evening, the room stood empty except for the dust motes floating in the last light from the windows. That night, Raphael's men gathered in the main hall. 50 of them. The men who had arrived in the black SUVs, the men in suits that cost more than Isabella's former annual salary, the men whose loyalty to Raphael Rossi extended into territories she barely understood. They stood in formation, waiting, their faces carved from granite. Raphael walked Isabella to the center of the room. His hand found the small of her back, a gesture so protective it made her understand what it meant to be claimed by someone powerful. This woman saved my life, Raphael announced. His voice filled the room like a weapon being drawn. She found me bleeding in my study. She could have called an ambulance. Could have let me die. Instead, she stayed beside me. She bandaged my wound. She listened to my confession. And when the federal agents arrived with warrants for my nephew and my wife's cousin, she stood without flinching. Tony and Enzo stepped forward. They bowed their heads, a gesture Isabella had seen in films but never imagined would be directed at her. From this moment forward, Raphael continued, Isabella Morgan is under my protection. She is family. Anyone who threatens her threatens every person in this room, and they threaten me. Is that understood? Yes, sir, came the unified response, a sound like thunder moving across water. Isabella's hands trembled. 6 months ago, she was invisible. She was the help. She was a woman with $34 to her name and no future visible on any horizon. Now she stood in a mansion surrounded by dangerous men who had just sworn themselves to her protection. 6 months later, the transformation was almost unreal. Emma and Lucas moved into the family wing of the mansion. Their bedroom had windows overlooking the bay. Real beds instead of the narrow mattresses they'd had in the Ashford nursery. Toys. Books. A life that didn't require them to be quiet or small or afraid. Isabella's converted closet was returned to storage. She now had a suite on the 2nd floor with a bathroom of her own, a sitting room, windows that let in morning light. She no longer counted dollars. She no longer skipped meals. Her credit score had been restored. The debt that never existed had been erased from every database, every collection agency, every record. But the real transformation was something quieter. Raphael taught Lucas to ride a bicycle in the mansion gardens, running beside the child as he wobbled forward, laughing when Lucas crashed gently into the hedge. Isabella watched from the terrace, her heart doing impossible things. One evening, Emma sat at the dinner table and asked the question that had been building for months. Is Mr. Rossi going to be our dad? Silence fell like a held breath. Raphael looked at Isabella across the candlelit table. They hadn't named what was growing between them, this bond forged in blood and darkness and the shared weight of loss. But it was there in every gesture. In the way he opened doors for her. In the way she touched his arm when his nightmares woke him. In the way they moved around each other like planets in established orbit. Would you want that? Raphael asked Emma gently. Yes, Emma said simply. Very much. Lucas nodded, his mouth full of pasta. You're kind. Like Vivi. Raphael's eyes found Isabella's. Then I think we need to have a conversation. The three of us. About what comes next. Later that night, Isabella and Raphael stood in the foyer where everything had begun. Where she'd knelt beside him with blood on her hands. Where the darkness had finally cracked open to let light through. You saved me on the worst night of my life, Isabella said, echoing his words from weeks ago. When I could have run. When any sane person would have run. And you saved me on mine, Raphael responded. I think that makes us bound to each other. For better or worse. For better, Isabella said firmly. Raphael took her hand. His rings caught the light, gold and silver, the visible weight of everything he'd built and everything he'd become. But his grip was gentle. Careful. Like he was still learning that holding someone didn't have to be about possession. It could be about protection. About choosing. I love you, he said. I don't know how it happened. I don't know when the moment was that you stopped being the nanny and started being everything. But I love you. Isabella stepped closer. I love you too. I was terrified of you. Of this place. Of men like you and the things you do. But I love you anyway. The sound of children playing echoed from the next room. Emma and Lucas building something with blocks, their voices bright and unburdened. Thank you, Raphael said, for not running. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the scariest-looking doors lead to the safest places. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other in the darkness, who had saved each other when saving seemed impossible. Outside, the San Francisco lights glowed against the night sky, reflecting in the bay like stars fallen to earth. This is what happens when one person reaches out at the exact moment another person needs saving. This is what becomes possible. Not just survival. Not just escape from debt and danger. But a life built on choosing each other. On standing together in a world that demands everything and offers nothing, finally understanding that sometimes, just sometimes, one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. If this story moved you, if Isabella and Raphael's journey reminded you that courage comes in quiet moments and that redemption is always possible, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that you are never truly alone, no matter how dark it gets. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it when Isabella saved Raphael? When she stood beside his powerful men and was claimed as family? Or was it the moment Emma asked if he would be their father? We wish you good health, joy in your days, and the wisdom to recognize when someone is reaching out their hand to save you. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is reach back. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video. Goodbye.